Yeah, so untamed emotions is for me a very valuable concept from one of my teachers, Richard Moss. And for me, he's kind of the master of working with the body, the mind, emotions. Um, and the distinction between tamed and untamed is that we you can consider emotions to be a type of thought, a form of thought, because you can distinguish feeling from emotion. And so for feeling, you don't need thought. And it's just a way of defining it. So there might be other ways of defining things to use these words, but whatever we can experience at the level of feeling without thought, we I would call that feeling. And when there is what we could call, say, what I feel, for example, shame, you cannot experience shame without thought. It's a form of thought. And so there has to be a narrative, an I in the center of a narrative for there to be an experience of shame. And then there is kinds of emotions, different kinds, lots of kinds. I call them all fear and pain. I would say shame is a form of pain. Anxiety is a form of fear. And some of these we have had a really hard time experiencing. And ultimately, what's the hardest thing for us to experience is feeling, deep feeling. So sadness, grief, joy. For those, you don't need thought. And in fact, thought would obscure them. And so tamed emotions are the emotions that we're addicted to. And so it's what we tend to create with our thinking, that habitually it will be very uncomfortable. For example, shame is a very uncomfortable emotion. But depending on the person, I might be very comfortable experiencing shame, even though it's very uncomfortable. And so it's tamed. I may hate it, but if I'm experiencing it regularly, it's a tamed emotion. So if I'm a frustrated person, depressed, angry, etc., there are emotions that I'm comfortable with. By comfortable, I mean your sense of self is not threatened. And so usually we experience them regularly. It's like a thing that's like, here we go again. I'm frustrated or I'm feeling bad, like a blueness, depressiveness, like feeling blue, like anguish is not the same as sad or in grief. And you can tell the difference is if there's a lot of a narrative going on. And so untamed emotions are emotions that we feel threatened by. There's a sense of self that's threatened by. And it depends on the person. It's like, what's your preference? It's like how your psyche developed. Some people, anger might be an untamed emotion. And it's really hard for them to feel and express anger. And for the next person, it could be anger is a tamed emotion and they're in it all the time. Same with shame. Um, so untamed emotions, in a sense, are what we need to, in order to grow, we need to learn to feel, because in a sense they are how we have mechanisms of defense, you could say, and it's, you could also call it, in a more spiritual sense, mechanisms of illusion, how we create an illusion of what reality is. And so reality might be, there's something that's very sad, but I can't feel sadness. Like deep sadness is could be very powerful. Or there could be a terror that's beyond, it's not an emotional terror, it's beyond thought. And then what we do is we create tamed emotions, a narrative that, in a sense, helps us bypass the untamed and keeps us distracted from the untamed. And that's something that we need to learn to see. Okay, for example, there's a certain kind of anxiety and confusion, and being confused, and not knowing, not understanding. And for some people, that's really hard to be with. And so we will create the habitual narratives that create a state of knowing, of a sense of knowing, or a sense of things are okay, I understand what's going on, I know what I need to do. But the next person, it might be the opposite. Some people are very comfortable in a constant state of drama, and those people usually become actors or therapists, or it's the kind of thing that becomes like the thing that I'm familiar with, I can go into, I can understand it, learn how it works, kind of play with it. And for the next person, it's really uncomfortable to be sad, to be in any kind of emotional, negative emotional. And so they will be constantly creating optimism and everything's okay, and avoiding anything that's a little dramatic. And, anybody who's dramatic, they would see as like problematic, and um, there's something wrong with them, or they don't get it, or why are they doing that? It makes no sense. They're just ruining their lives, this kind of, but that's, for that person, that's in the shadow. So a person that's always optimistic, obviously there is, I'm generalizing, right? Um, but feeling a kind of habitual okayness that's not real or deep isn't necessarily a good thing, and vice versa. Feeling a lot of movement of emotion, and a kind of a sense of, I would say, kind of overly emotional also isn't necessarily meaning that one is going deep and feeling a lot. It could be a form of avoiding um, a deeper grief or fear. And so, just to wrap it up, the difference between tame and untamed is what we're comfortable with, which reinforces our sense of self. We've learned to be comfortable there, and what we're not. And this was what we learned in the environment we grew up. So it's, in a sense, kind of handed down by our caregivers or society, the parents. If one of our parents cannot handle their child being angry, and it's very, very difficult to be angry as a child, then that child, that's going to be an untamed emotion, most likely. Maybe not, right? It's no guarantee of how it's going to work in that particular person. I'd say the best way is to notice what you're comfortable with. It's at at first you would one would, I'm not saying you specifically, the way the mind would work and create this is um, it would appear as something that's happening to us that we're a victim of, in the sense that we are on the receiving end. And so it's like, here I am again, life is doing this to, it's happening to me, and I am there is no power in me to do anything with this. It's happening. And it'll be some form of feeling and a narrative, but specifically talking about the feeling aspect, that we don't like. But the key is that it's repetitive. It's like here I am again, this is happening to me again. And that is the tamed. And so the first thing is to realize we are creating that. We are the agents of that. And by seeing through that self-hypnotic spell, we could say we crack the shell of our self-involvement. Because we've created, this is something we learned to do as a child, is in order to cope with whatever was happening, right? And then we create an emotional state and a repetitive narrative that feels comfy and cozy in a sense, even though we don't like it, because it's better than the terrifying, painful thing that's actually happening. Yeah, it's I'd say it's almost even necessary. It's a way to cope. It's necessary. It's just how the mind works. It's a young mind in a unknown universe with these giant beings who are completely, deciding what our life is. Gigantic beings, which is our parents, literally. Right? It's pretty fucking scary. And so, and all our life is dictated by these gigantic beings. We're at complete mercy of our livelihood and our well-being. And so then our mind offers a way to, no matter what's happening, at least you have this kind of set of states of emotions that you can cover it all up in and be okay with, even if those, which mostly are, they're dark, painful, difficult, uncomfortable, all kinds. And maybe they're not. Maybe the personality, it finds a way to create an optimism, and then that optimism will be the shell that needs to be broken for the terror and the despair to be experienced, of reality, of what actually is being felt, or what is actually being experienced. And so to generalize, I would say just notice that which seems like happens to you at the kind of emotional level, that's here we go again, kind of habitual, that's going to be the tamed. And so the untamed will reveal itself in its own time as we see through the tamed. You don't have to look for the untamed. It'll reveal itself when you see the tamed. And you see the self-hypnotic nature of it. When you see that, I'm actually kind of choosing this, and there's something I kind of like about it, and there's kind of a little addictive kind of thing around this. That's like that, ooh, I've been doing this all along. It's like, yeah, since I was 3 years old. And that's where it's important to be gentle and caring and understanding that it was needed. It was a way to manage. But if you're seeing through it, if you're questioning it, it seems like it's about time for growing out of it. And as we grow out of it, then we're gonna go like, oh, whoa, now this is, whoa, that doesn't feel very comfortable, and maybe it's actually joy or excitement. Like it could be something that's extremely good and life affirming that we are terrified by, and we actually cover with and I've seen this happen not in myself and in others, where we cover this expansive, joyful, beautiful thing with an anxiety and a fear, because the fear is tamed. And so it's like, oh, I'm nervous, I'm worried, I'm stressed. This is how it used to be for me. And then it was actually joy. It was actually an expansiveness, an aliveness, a beauty, and vice versa, right? When deep grief was presenting itself, and there was a self-involved kind of blueness, a depressiveness that I was very good at creating until I saw through it, and the grief started to break through, and it was grief where I basically lost complete control, in the sense of life and the river flowing and the body shaking and the body grieving, and no thoughts, just absolute unexplainable grief. And the same with terror. I remember sitting every morning, and then my body would just shake in terror. I would close my eyes and I didn't know what I was afraid of. It was just terror flowing routinely. And then in the afternoon, grief. And that's when you can tell if the actual narrative starts to become kind of like an afterthought, and there's just a flow. If the body is activated and something's moving through it, you would feel it. That's when you're starting to go into the deeper feeling and the untamed. But you don't control that. What you can see is, by seeing through what the addiction to the tamed and the thoughts, then that other process happens. It's the river just takes over. And sometimes it could be really gentle, but it's deep. It could be really quiet, but it's deep. And the that smallness, insecure, it could have an aspect that is real in the sense that the one seen, it would be seen as this vulnerability that is so, there is a preciousness of a certain, what's the word, like a delicacy to it, but then it's so vulnerable that we wrap it into smallness with a narrative that's not good enough. And so in a sense it's somehow related. It's kind of fits, but it's a complete distortion of what it is. And that narrative is self-involved, it's self-created, self-hypnotic. And if, because you're mentioning it, is you're seeing it, and I'm just confirming, very, very, very likely that's what it is. And as you discover anger and you can express it, things will start to shaken up and good things will happen. Yeah, you're welcome. But it's scary, I get it. It's scary because that's what you know yourself to be, and it's ending. It's ending. It must end. You cannot sustain that much more because it requires so much energy and it creates so much friction with everything. I understand, yeah. What I can say is that true safety is fear word, is towards what feels unsafe when you're in a false safety. When we're in a safety that's conditional on our state and our story and emotions being the certain way. Like that safety is is not very safe because it's very conditional and transitory. It's always in threat. I need to keep an emotional mental state in a certain way for safety to be experienced. And I'm pointing to true safety is not conditional. It does not depend on situations, context, states, thoughts, emotions. But in that transition, we must, if we want to discover true safety, we must go fearward towards what feels unsafe. And if my words aren't inspiring enough, you can look at stories and myths, and they're all pointing to that. Like look at a movie. I love Jim Carrey's done a bunch of movies about this, and one is the Truman Show. It's exactly about that. And what I mean, where the movie ends, if people haven't seen it, cover your ears. It's an old movie, but it's really good. Where it ends is he's at the door, and he's like, "Okay, I'm going through." But that door is like it's so perfect because it really shows it's the complete unknown to him, but it's reality. And he's crossed his biggest fear in order to get the opportunity to cross the door. And at the door, the biggest temptation to go back appears, which is his father saying, "You're safe here."